So Mark, we're so grateful for your support and your willingness to take on this very new approach to BirdQuest. Before turning it over to Mark, I do want to mention a couple things. One, I want to thank, I know a number of you are members on here, and I want to thank you for your support of our work. For those who may not be as familiar with the Land Trust, for 30 years now, we've been protecting undeveloped land, and much of that is driven by bird habitat protection. We've now secured more than 25,000 acres. And I thought rather than look back, I just want to mention the project we completed last week and two that are pending as kind of giving a sense of the range of habitat work we're doing. And I'm pleased to report that last week we completed a conservation easement on over 500 acres bordering Queen Catherine Marsh. That's an Audubon designated important bird area. And that will remain private property. But if you ever in Watkins Glen look to the east, we've now secured about a square mile of that hillside that includes farmland, but also mature forest next to the wetland and water courses and so on. Now coming up, just a different project, Connecticut Hill, another Audubon important bird area. We've been helping the state grow that area because that extensive forest is really unique in our region. And it's a small puzzle piece, but we're under contract to add 60 more acres to Connecticut Hill. And what's important, it's in Newfield, it has a lot of road frontage. And if we weren't buying it, it would probably be a number of different house lots. And we think there are better places to put those houses. And lastly, I just want to mention perhaps the most exciting in Lansing, we're working on creating a new preserve on the lake that will have more than 4,000 feet of shoreline, as well as 250 acres of diverse habitat. And that's all through the support of folks like Mark and all of you on this call. So I want to thank you for all that you do. And I want to mention just before turning it over to Mark, that aside from the support he's given the Land Trust, I am what I would call a casual birder. And I want to thank him for educating me and the inspiration he provides. I'm a visitor to the Cayuga bird list, so I'm not on the list, but I go through the bird club, kind of the back door. And I really appreciate learning more and inspiring me to do my work. So Mark, thanks so much for all that you've done, in particular this year, breaking us into the world of Zoom. So with that, I'll take it away.
All right, thank you, Andy, very much. I'll share my screen now. And I hope everyone can see my screen. Is it okay, Kelly? Looks all right, okay. And so let's begin here. So thank you, Andy, very much. And thank you to everyone for attending. Maybe even just 6 weeks ago, I wasn't sure what I would do with this year's Spring BirdQuest. For those of you who don't know, the Spring BirdQuest, as Andy said, I've been doing it since 2006. This is the 15th one. Normally, it involves my leading field trips to land trust preserves and also raising funds on the basis of pledges that people issue for bird species that I find on those land trust preserves over Memorial Day weekend. But I was wondering this year whether I could do anything, whether I should do anything at all, whether it was worthwhile or even appropriate to do an event with birding and having fun on preserves and fundraising and sharing with no field trips and with everyone preoccupied with the pandemic and the lockdown. But then I got some timely encouragement from friends and especially from Ken Kemphuis and Diane Morton. That planted the seed, and I discussed further with Land Trust staff. And here is how it turned out. The focus I tried to keep on birding, fundraising, and sharing. The birding part, I ended up making 22 visits to 11 preserves throughout May. I decided that since I was doing it by myself and with my family, I could extend the whole event to the whole month. And so 22 visits to 11 preserves. Here's the list: the Getch's Wetland Preserve in Caroline with its expansive grasslands and cattail marsh habitat and open water and a small patch of mature deciduous woods. Campbell Meadow, which is a preserve owned by the town of Dryden, subject to a conservation easement held by the Land Trust in the floodplain of Fall Creek. the Genung Nature Preserve in Freeville, which was donated to the Land Trust in 2005, if I'm not mistaken, by Mildred Sherwood, and then transferred by the Land Trust to the village of Freeville to become a village preserve, subject to a conservation or easement still held by the Land Trust. Genung, with stands of tall pines and a long stretch along a big looping oxbow on Fall Creek, and what I think is the region's most wonderful stand of ironwood trees, which you see here in the picture with my son Tilden and my wife Miyoko. Ironwood trees with their muscular looking trunks. The Logan Hill Nature Preserve in Candor, a 350-acre preserve, the first 285 acres of which were donated to the Land Trust by Betsy Darlington and Dick Darlington back in 2015, with big expansive grassy areas and wooded habitat, a truly wonderful place for birds. The Dorothy McElroy Bird Sanctuary in Summerhill, with its fen and its deep shadowy hemlock forest. The Roy H. Park Preserve and the Lindsay Parsons Biodiversity Preserve, which are two of perhaps the two most renowned birding hotspots in the Land Trust portfolio, for which ironically I did not take any landscape photos this spring, sorry. The Kingsbury Woods Conservation Area, 48 acres of woods along Lick Brook, donated to the Land Trust in 2008 by Sheila Kingsbury, and the Sweedler Preserve at Lick Brook, which is just downstream from Kingsbury Woods, downstream down the road, and the Salmon Creek Bird Sanctuary in Lansing, shown here with my wife Miyoko. So Miyoko and Tilden were the ones mainly who joined me. I did some walks alone, but most of it was with Miyoko, sometimes with Tilden too. And together, we found 118 species of birds throughout the month on Land Trust preserves. Considering the pledges that people generously offered per bird species that I found, will result in at least, I believe, $4,000 donations to the $4,000 in donations to the Land Trust. We, of course, welcome more. So that's the birding and the fundraising. And I said birding, fundraising, and sharing. The sharing really is tonight. The Land Trust also has been sharing my sightings and some of my photos on social media. They created a webpage for me also to share observations and notes. But really, it's all about tonight. And I recognize that given the sheer number of visits and preserves, it's impractical. It's probably tedious for me to present trip reports from everywhere, or even just to rip through highlights from everywhere. So I decided to make this talk not so much about what I found, but rather about what I learned. Not so much about the things I saw and heard only, but rather the things that made me stop and think, the things that I found most curious and amazing and enlightening. And I decided also to organize this talk by themes rather than by date or by field trip visit or even by site. And so let us proceed to the first theme, cold. Cold was indeed the theme of the first half of May this year, as I think you probably all recall. And I saw birds dealing with the cold in various ways. The first one, attitude. It's not really a resilient solution. It's more like the unbroken will to do what you have to do. This photo of a male rose-breasted grosbeak I took on Logan Hill on Saturday, May 9th, a day when the temperature didn't rise above the 30s all day. It was probably in the 20s or low 30s as we arrived, with 15 miles an hour wind, gusts of 30 miles an hour or more, and a couple of inches of snow even. Not exactly ideal conditions for birding and not exactly ideal conditions to be a bird. And yet, right upon our arrival, we heard a rose-breasted grosbeak, male rose-breasted grosbeak, singing his heart out, as if to show us all that he didn't care about the cold. He had more important things to do. He had to get on with his life. And similarly, on that same day, Miyoko joined me, all bundled up, as you see, full of good spirits and intrepid, bundled up. And in fact, we ended up at the preserve for more than 3 hours, and we had a great time. We saw lots of other birds besides that rose-breasted grosbeak. So attitude is a great way to deal with the cold. The second resilient solution, the second approach, is shelter in place. This, of course, is familiar to both humans and birds. The following week, we continued to have this massive cold snap, this polar vortex sitting over us this polar vortex sending this massive Arctic air right above us with 3 nights in a row of temperatures dropping into the 20s, daylight temperatures, again, not rising above the low 40s. And those are perilous conditions for breeding insectivores, such as these tree swallows. Now, tree swallows can eat berries. They can eat bayberries and perhaps other fruit to tide themselves over in cold weather. But if I'm not mistaken, there are no berries really around yet, no bayberries. And so as far as I could tell, their resilience strategy was just to shelter in place, to stay in their nest boxes or their other nests in land trust preserves with tree swallow boxes as Campbell Meadow, such as Campbell Meadow, as you see here, also the Getch's Wetland Preserve. During occasional warm spells in late April and early May, you could see maybe 20 plus tree swallows zooming around, catching insects, returning to the nest. But on these cold days, you saw no tree swallows at all. They were all literally hunkering down in their boxes. And sorry, by the way, for any confusion I'm creating by showing tree swallows out and about in these photos, but I figured that that was that would be more interesting, better eye candy than showing just empty boxes alone. Anyway, after 3 days and 3 nights of such cold and probably very little or no food, I was wondering if the tree swallows had survived. But fortunately, when the weather warmed up again, I did see tree swallows out and about again. They seem to have gotten through it, and apparently undiminished numbers, apparently undiminished capabilities and energy for breeding. And so good for them. And let's hope that we humans can emerge similarly strong from our lockdown. Okay, and the third cold resilience solution for birds that I witnessed this spring is to go to the sunshine, both for their own bodily thermal gains and perhaps more importantly, to find concentrations of insects. I like to call this the east-facing edge effect. That is the tendency of birds to accumulate on sunny mornings after cold nights in places with concentrated sunshine, while other areas are still cold and dark. And so on May 14th, 15th, and 16th, I found a wonderful sunny edge at the Janung Nature Preserve with fantastic close views, long views of warblers and other songbirds finding insects despite the cold, including this chestnut-sided warbler, blue-headed vireo, Wilson's warbler on 2 consecutive days. This is an uncommon migrant, not a breeding bird. We see them only for a couple weeks every spring and maybe a couple weeks in the fall, but I saw them for 2 consecutive, they're uncommon even when they're around, but it was present for 2 consecutive days at Janung. American redstart, pine warbler, which Nita Irby and I saw together at the Janung Nature Preserve, but I failed to photograph. Diane Morton saw this one on May 17th and photographed it. Thank you, Diane. And Blackburnian warbler, a lovely male that we saw at close range. So these birds all could accumulate. They accumulated in this habitat because it was so sunny and it was so warm. It felt warm. It felt warm even to me, despite the temperature, the mercury reading about 40. Here is what I mean on the map, this spot that I'm talking about. This is a map of the Janung Nature Preserve. Here you see this very deep oxbow in Fall Creek that I mentioned before. And right here where the orange arrow is pointing, there's a spot where the bank of Fall Creek, you look out over the water, there's no trees because the creek is there, and the sun in late morning in May is in the southeast. And so this bank is directly facing the sun. It's even angled up toward the sun, like a solar panel. And so I recommend this all to you as a place to go on on sunny mornings after cold nights in May in migration season. I think maybe you'll have a chance to have wonderful birding as I did. So the next theme also took shape at the Janung Nature Preserve because in addition to these other songbirds, here I also found these birds, a blue-winged warbler and a palm warbler. They were interesting and wonderful, not only because of their beauty and their proximity and the good views that they gave us over a long period of time, but also because it was a chance for me to learn their chip notes. Now, a brief word about bird vocalizations. Scientists recognize, those of you who have been on field trips with me know this, scientists recognize two broad categories of bird vocalizations. There are songs, which are complex and usually structured, and they serve the limited purposes of either attracting and retaining mates or territory defense. Songs are usually sung by males, but sometimes also by females for territory defense. Whereas calls, the second category, encompass everything else. Calls are usually very simple, often just one note. They're issued more or less equally by males and females, and they serve to communicate a wide range of other information, such as simply location or distress or begging or other very specific behaviors. And so when a male blue-winged warbler is singing, when he's singing, he's saying, I'm a blue-winged warbler, I am male, I am awesome, I have a territory, it's a great territory. Female blue-winged warblers, you should come check it out, you should come check me out, we should nest together, we should make babies, and by the way, other male blue-winged warblers, you better stay away because I'm so strong and I'm gonna oust you from my territory if you come anywhere close by. Whereas the chip note of a blue-winged warbler, which sounds like this, a much simpler vocalization, simply communicates, here I am, I'm a blue-winged warbler. I believe that's what that chip note means. Here I am, I'm a blue-winged warbler, and then similarly for a palm warbler, that slightly different chip note means, here I am, I'm a palm warbler. So, as you can see, while chip notes are a bit esoteric, they are very useful because what birder wouldn't want to know that there is a palm warbler saying, here I am, I'm a palm warbler, or what birder wouldn't want to know that there's a blue-winged warbler saying, here I am, look over here, I'm a blue-winged warbler. Both males and females, it helps you to find birds and figure out who they are and where they are. So that's the why of learning chip notes. And now for some thoughts about how. Again, on my field trips, I like to say that there are three main steps I like to deploy for learning bird sound ID in the field. The first is to just get out and listen. The second is to describe the sounds to yourself. And so the chip note of a cardinal to me sounds like a rock hammer that is hitting a little piece of flint, or a common yellowthroat sounds like somebody taking an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper and flicking it. And a black-throated blue warbler's chip note sounds like a raindrop landing on a leaf. It sounds very dead, like that. And then finally, so just describe it to yourself in whatever way makes most sense to you. And then finally, to learn familiar bird sounds like those, and then to use them as points of reference for unfamiliar ones. So a northern water thrush sounds kind of like that flinty chip note of a cardinal, but it's much more, it's much stronger and more explosive. And a black-throated green also sounds like a cardinal, but it's less explosive. And a mourning warbler sounds kind of like a cross between a cardinal and a common yellowthroat. And a Lincoln sparrow sounds kind of like the dead, leathery raindrop falling on a leaf sound of a blue-winged warbler, but with a little more complexity. And so this is very useful for me, but I also realize that especially for someone learning many bird calls at once, or bird songs at once for that matter, all at the same time, it can get a little unwieldy, this compared to that, and that other bird compared to that other bird. It quickly gets to be a big map of other birds that's sort of hard to sort out. And also, it's difficult to explain all this to others in a concise and clear way. And so I decided to try to create something. I did this in just a few minutes using Excel. As you see here, there is an XY plane here with, on the x-axis, on the scale of 0 to 10, gentle to explosive, and on the y-axis, on a scale also from 0 to 10, actually nothing reached the level of 10, so it's 0 to 9, simple to complex. I said before that a Lincoln sparrow sounds like a black-throated blue warbler, but it's more complex. And a palm warbler sounds like an eastern phoebe, but it's a little bit more complex and it's a little bit more gentle. And a blue-winged warbler sounds like a northern cardinal, except it's even more explosive and it is a little more complex because it has that buzzy quality to it. And so this is completely subjective. All these 1 to 10 ratings are just, I put it into the spreadsheet based on what I thought. And it's completely unscientific, unlike, say, sonograms. But also, unlike sonograms, it allows you, as you see here, to compare many bird species at once. And to say, you know, a white-throated sparrow is very similar to a black-throated green warbler, or a white northern water thrush, as you see here. Northern water thrush is similar to a chipmunk. Cameo appearance from a chipmunk here. And so this is also, I thought, pretty useful, maybe worth sharing. And you can make adjustments as needed. But I also recognize that there are limitations. As you see here, hairy and downy woodpecker are listed on the same point here because they have the same degree of explosiveness and the same degree of complexity, but hairy and downy woodpeckers don't sound like each other because of pitch. And similarly, Lincoln sparrow and black-capped chickadee are located very close to each other on this chip note map, but they sound nothing like each other at all. Black-capped chickadee sounds like and Lincoln sparrow sounds like, but they're both gentle, not explosive, rather simple, but they sound nothing like each other. What you need is a third dimension. But how do you portray bird chip notes in terms of 3 characters, 3 dimensions, and let alone overlay them with each other? Well, I worked on that a little bit too. And it turns out that there's a way also in Excel, using the same data, but adding now a third dimension, you can create a chart like this. This is a so-called radar chart. It's confusing. It has nothing to do with radar like weather radar, which birders also pay attention to. But instead, it just looks like radar. That's why it has that informal name. And here you can see that you can map out the 3 characters at once, so that blue-winged warbler here is shown as being very explosive and quite complex and also quite high in pitch, whereas the smaller triangle of a palm warbler, small especially in these 2 dimensions, is very gentle, much simpler, and still fairly high-pitched, though not as high-pitched. And so that's a way for you to create these overlays. You can do it for 10 species at once or 20 species at once, however you want. I find it to be also somewhat illuminating even for highly similar bird chip notes such as these. Black-throated green, white-throated, and swamp sparrow, black-throated green warbler, white-throated sparrow, and swamp sparrow all have chip notes that sound to me very similar to each other. But using this chart, you can kind of explain to yourself and explain to others succinctly, compactly, that they all are similar. They're all pretty explosive. They're all not too complex. They're all pretty high pitched, but the black-throated green is a little more explosive, a little higher pitched. The white-throated sparrow is a little bit more explosive than the swamp sparrow, and so on. So again, completely unscientific and subjective, but that's how I decided to try to sort things out for myself. Since, you know, on this modified Spring Bird Quest, I'm both the field trip leader and the field trip audience. I tried to help myself to learn. And I hope that this is at least fun or perhaps even useful to some of you in some way as well. So the next theme, it's quite different, change of pace. The folklore and etymology of brown thrashers. Miyoko and I found this brown thrasher at the Lindsay Parsons Biodiversity Preserve on May 17th, Sunday, May 17th. It was singing and singing a beautiful, loud, complex song out at the top of a tree in the bright blue sky for a long time. And Miyoko made this sound recording. This one you might have to listen closely for because the bird was far away. Oops, sorry, hang on a second. Note that the thrasher has a tendency to double its phrase, like that. That doubling is a good way of distinguishing it from mockingbirds and catbirds, who are in the same family, or the taxonomic family, Mimidae. So anyway, that was a wonderful, wonderful performance, a virtuoso performance. We just sat and watched it. We just stood there and watched for a long time. And there is a bit of interesting folklore apropos of this. Old folklore, at least 100 years old. And it's a story that goes something like this. There was a man, a respected townsman, who had one fault in certain people's eyes, which was that he would skip church on Sunday and go fishing instead. And so one day, despite having heard from the preacher, you know, you really should come to church. Don't you know what awaits you on Judgment Day if you don't come? He just packed up his boat and went to the pond and went fishing to enjoy himself, and he was catching some fish. But then he heard a brown thrasher singing in a tree nearby. Heathen, go to church, go to church. Fishy fisher, devil catcher, heathen, church, devil gonna catch it, fishy fisher, heathen. And so this man was quite spooked. He was aghast. He pulled in his line and he grabbed his oars and he rowed as fast as he could to shore, and he ran home and he changed back into his Sunday clothes and he went back to church. And he stayed in church and he never missed Sunday services again. That's the story. It's not lost on me that for bird watchers like us and like many of you, this story might not actually scare you into going to church on Sunday, but rather might make you want to go out and watch thrashers, as we did on that Sunday. It's a bit ironic, but oh well. And that was not the only thrasher that we saw at Lindsay Parsons that morning. Just down the trail a bit, we saw another thrasher, almost surely a different one, out in the middle of the grassy trail. And it had a prey item in its bill, which it was beating the heck out of. It was, when you blow up the photo, I think it was a tadpole, and it was just whacking the bejabbers out of this tadpole on the ground. And it was quite grisly, actually, but it was a kind of mesmerizing too. It was like watching a sushi master preparing tadpole sashimi. And I was excited, not only because of this close, wide open view and this behavior, well, also because this was the first time I'd actually seen a thrasher thrashing anything. So when I got home, I decided to look up the bird named thrasher to confirm this etymological link with the behavior. And I found that it's actually a bit more complicated. Their reputable sources differ. The Birder's Handbook, which is a seminal book from, I believe, around late 70s or early 80s, all about natural history and bird behavior and taxonomy. That book says that thrashers are, curiously enough, so named because they were once called thrushes, same Anglo-Saxon root as thrush, not because they thrash around. But more recently, the Sibley Guide to Bird Life and Behavior says thrashers probably get their name from their well-known behavior of thrashing the ground for insects, though one account suggests the name came from a bird thrashing a nest intruder. So we have three explanations here: that it's related to thrush, that it's related to thrashing the ground or thrashing a nest intruder, and then my experience is a fourth case in which it's not thrashing the ground to find insects, but rather thrashing a found item on the ground. And so I guess we just have to accept that there's a certain remaining degree of mystery, or perhaps the word comes from many sources at once. It also got me thinking about whether there's any linkage at all with the skateboard term thrasher. But I think there is probably, almost surely, no connection between the bird and the skateboard in either direction. Although I do think that the name thrasher probably the thrasher for skateboarding comes from thrash metal rock music, in which the guitarists thrash their strings intensely, or maybe they thrash their bodies, they thrash their heads in headbanging with the thrash metal music. Although it did occur to me when thinking about thrashers and skateboard thrashers that the movement of a skateboarder in a skateboard bowl or a half pipe is back and forth, up and down, is kind of similar to what I saw that thrasher doing to that tadpole. And so who knows? And by the way, this photo is of the skateboard champion, Tony Hawk. That is his real name. And Hawk, of course, is a bird, but I believe that that is almost surely a coincidence too. All right. Well, I think that's enough about the folklore etymology lesson here. Enough with this Spring Bird Quest humanities interlude. let's get back to some birds and some science here. Fun fact, little and big. On May 19th at the Kingsbury Woods Conservation Area, I found this winter wren right by the parking area. It gave me really close views as it sang for a long time. A tiny little bird with a big, big voice. This is a recording that I made of this very bird. What a joy it was to hear that song and to see that little bird devoting such energy to singing that song. Notice how long that last song is, all in one breath, really. It's as virtuosic as any famous diva. And so that was exciting enough in itself. But then, not more than maybe 40 minutes later, at the Sweetler Preserve at Lick Brook, just down the road and just downstream, I found these birds. These are fledgling common ravens. And I found them right at the top of the spectacular Lick Brook Gorge, right next to the trail. And this was exciting for several reasons. First of all, this happens to have been the very site, if I understand properly, where in 1993, birders found what was the first raven nest to be found in our area, in Tompkins County, I believe, in the entire 20th century up to that point, 1993. And here they were again, 27 years later, the successors, maybe even the descendants of those first 1993 nesting ravens, again, breeding successfully. And another aspect is that these ravens were just so charming. They were just delightful to watch. They're just these big hulking birds, and yet somehow they were extremely cute. They're babies. They have a certain wildness to them, especially in such a wild, spectacular place. And yet somehow they seem gentle and contemplative and sentient. They were testing their movements and they were absorbing new sights and sounds, looking around in a way that was, I thought, inescapably reminiscent of a human baby or a human toddler. And they seemed, and I don't think this is excessive anthropomorphism, they seemed even to be expressing emotion almost when calling to their parents, loneliness, or expressing emotion when they cuddled up to each other, of brotherly or sibling love. So I felt so lucky to have such great views of the big voiced little tiny winter wren and the big bodied little or young toddler common ravens right near each other, right within the same hour. And then that juxtaposition between the wren and the raven made me ask myself this. How much heavier is a common raven than a winter wren? Winter wren is one of our smallest songbirds. There's almost nothing that's smaller than them. Kinglets, maybe a couple of warbler species, but 4 inches long from bill tip to tail tip. It's very small and it's very light. Whereas common ravens are the largest songbirds in North America. So how much heavier on average is a common raven compared to a winter wren? I looked it up, and I'll share the answer with you in a minute. I don't suppose people would want to try to share answers in the chat. I'll leave a couple minutes for people to sort of click around and to find the chat here. Kelly, you can let me know if people are sharing the chat or if I should move on. I'll give it another 10, 15 seconds or so.
We have our first guess is 80 times.
Not a bad guess. I'll just go ahead here. A winter wren weighs about 9 grams, about 1/3 of an ounce. And a common raven on average weighs about 1.2 kilograms, 1,200 grams. So on average, common ravens weigh about 130 times more than winter wrens, which actually makes sense because if a wren is about 4 inches long from bill tip to tail tip and a raven is about 20 inches long from bill tip to tail tip, about the same size as a red-tailed hawk, then it's a 5-fold difference in length. But since mass is a function of volume, then you take the linear difference and you cube it, 5 cubed is 125. So that is sort of about what you'd expect if you do the back of the envelope math. 130 times. I just think that's a pretty cool, fun fact. What that means is that in terms of mass, a winter wren is to a raven as an average sized human being, this is my son Tilden, is to an African bush elephant plus 3 hippopotami. So this is 150, 160 pounds compared to nearly 10 tons. Anyway, so onward with the SBQ Springboard Quest themes. It's not just birds that created moments of wonder and enlightenment for me, but also other living things, amphibians, reptiles, and invertebrates. Amphibians and reptiles, very close encounters with green frogs and other frogs that you could hear and see at low wet spots in multiple preserves. Also, excellent toad watching, American toad watching, both in terms of numbers and proximity and diversity, from orange ones to black ones, from ones about the size of your fist down to the size of a peanut M&M, and also wonderful behaviors, including, as we see here, many toads gathering together in mating frenzies, a mating brawl in which females were laying eggs and males were inseminating them and holding on to them in amplexus to prevent other males from getting near the females that they had just mated with. Also, close view of a garter snake at Logan Hill. And as for invertebrates, butterflies and moths, we saw lots of moths. Here are just a couple of photographs. This one is called a white-lined black, very easy to see here, spectacular. You probably saw some of those if you went around into the woods too. And this other photo here shows a moth. I don't know if you can see it. It's nearly impossible to see. It's not over here. It's not over here. It is here. This is the head of the moth. These are the wings. This is the body. This is a moth, I believe, of the genus Melanolophia, which we never would have seen, of course, except that we saw it actually fly in and alight there. Other butterflies at Logan Hill, we had a wonderful day when the sun, we went back to Logan Hill on a warm day, and in the sunshine on the road, in the wet areas, we saw lots of butterflies gathering. The year's first eastern tiger swallowtail for me, an eastern comma, collecting minerals on the moist dirt road, a juvenile's dusky wing, and views of eastern comma, an angle-wing butterfly, both basking with its wings spread and foraging with its wings closed. Here you can see the white mark. You might be able to see the white mark that gives the eastern comma its name, like the punctuation mark. Other invertebrates too. Other invertebrates that were new and exciting and wonderful for me. This is a calligrapher beetle, which Nita Irby and I saw at the Genung Nature Preserve. This is a nomad bee. A nomad bee, also known as a cuckoo bee, lays its eggs in other ground nesting bees' nests, and its larvae then eat the host larvae and then eat the pollen and nectar provisions left by the unwitting, hapless, unfortunate host. We had at least 2 species, and in fact, I believe this represents 2 different taxonomic families of giant millipedes. And this wonderful creature, this is a red velvet mite. It looks like it's some kind of blow up in a microscope photo of something very, very tiny, like a blood corpuscle. But actually, they're quite large. They're about the size of an apple seed. And we saw this at the Logan Hill Nature Preserve, did some research on them afterwards. Red velvet mites are in the family Trombiidae. They're arachnids. And while there are many species of red velvet mites, we don't know which one this is. Some red velvet mite species have a wonderful, intriguing life history in which the males come out in spring. They create so-called love gardens in which they find blades of grass and decorate them with droplets of their sperm. They leave lots of droplets of sperm around, creating this glittering garden. They weave a path out of silk leading up to the garden, and then they try to find females and lead them to the garden, whereupon they dance, and if the female likes them, she takes the spermatophore, the sperm globule, up into herself and impregnates herself. But if another red velvet mite, a male red velvet mite, finds this garden before a female does, he'll destroy it and he'll leave his own sperm there instead. So that's a red velvet mite. Unfortunately, by the way, for sweets lovers, but fortunately for the red velvet mites do not taste like red velvet cake. In fact, they taste quite bad. Scientists cannot seem to get predators to eat them at all. And indeed, the red color seems to be a signal to predators that, hey, this guy tastes bad, leave him alone. So finally, on to the last bird-related theme of my presentation. Honorary water oozles. This is a water ouzel, more properly known as an American dipper. It's one of the most distinctive and iconic birds of the American mountain west, the Rockies, the Sierra, the Cascades. And the term ouzel, by the way, is an old world term for blackbirds. Blackbirds, which are thrushes in the old world. Dippers are indeed related to thrushes, but they're not very closely related. They're really something unto themselves. They're the only songbird that can swim underwater. They propel themselves through the water like penguins. And they sing a loud song above the sound of the rushing streams. They can stand in raging water. And they were a favorite of the great Scottish-American naturalist and environmental philosopher John Muir, who devoted a whole chapter of his book, The Mountains of California, to the water ouzel. And I'm going to read this off to you because it's beautiful. The waterfalls of the Sierra are frequented by only one bird, the ouzel or water thrush, Cinclus mexicanus. He is a singularly joyous and lovable little fellow about the size of a robin, clad in a plain waterproof suit of bluish gray with a tinge of chocolate on the head and shoulders. In form, he is about as smoothly plump and compact as a pebble that has been whirled at a pothole, the flowing contour of his body being interrupted only by his strong feet and bill, the crisp wingtips, and the upslanted wren-like tail. Oozles seem so completely part and parcel of the streams they inhabit, they scarce suggest any other origin than the streams themselves, and one might almost be pardoned in fancying they come direct from the living waters like flowers from the ground. Very beautiful, very evocative, and we don't really quite have anything like American dippers in our area, like water oozles in our area. Louisiana water thrushes are the closest thing. They also live in stream beds. And I scarcely expected, though, to find anything that would remind me of this description. But I did. I did a couple of times on this spring bird quest. This, as birders know, is the familiar and ubiquitous yellow warbler. And while there are some obvious differences, this is a yellow warbler outside of its usual expected habitat of sunny, brushy areas inside the shrubs, on top of shrubs. But it's foraging along the lakeshore by these big rocks, kind of like a dipper. And it kind of, if you use your imagination, if you squint, it looks like a dipper because of its contours that look like a pebble interrupted only by the bill and the feet, its upturned wren-like tail, and its behavior. And so, yes, with some imagination or with some screen filtering, you can kind of give yourself a feeling similar to maybe what John Muir was feeling when he watches the water ouzel in the mountains of California. And that was not the only one. This is a Swainson's thrush. This is a boreal migrant. They breed in the taiga of Canada, and they appear here in migration only for a week or two in spring and then a week or 2 or 3 in fall. We normally see them in the shadowy woods, close to the ground often, and we do not see them doing this, standing on rocks in the middle of streams, and yet I did. Or at least I didn't think we see them doing this. I heard a report from Alicia Plotkin that she saw a Swainson's thrush doing this, or doing this, actually wading in the stream like a dipper, as you see here. I looked in the scientific literature, several sources, several authoritative sources, comprehensive sources, and I could not find anything that describes this stream wading and rock, streamside rock foraging behavior. And so while this honorary water oozle theme, it's kind of silly and fun, it also shows that familiar birds hold real potential for the unexpected. And so now in closing, I'd like to discuss the purpose of the Springbird Quest. The purpose of the Springbird Quest is to celebrate and strengthen the connections among birds, land, and people. And I like to think of it this way, with a diagram like this. We can start at this lower right corner of the triangle, people, us, our communities, our poor, troubled communities. We're so wounded and divided. We're angry, rightfully so, I guess, and desperate. And yet, despite the terrible troubles that our communities are facing, we also see in this triangle among people incredible resilience and generosity. And moving along this right edge where people and birds connect, obviously we all have our pressing concerns now, but still birds can provide us some solace and some comfort, and maybe even some meaning and perspective about how to endure and how to survive and how to stay positive. Or at least they provide some kind of distraction, a moment or two of distraction on our walks, hopefully also in this presentation. And it's not just me, but it's countless other people in our community going birding this month, on land trust properties and elsewhere, each finding their own highlights. I asked people to share their highlights. We saw some of them in the chat. There was a sedge wren at the Getchis Wetland Preserve. There was a Lawrence's warbler at the Janung Nature Preserve before I even went there. Suzanne Giffen, who is here on the call tonight, I believe, was telling us in the chat about her experience at the Keogh Nature Preserve and other land trust preserves down in the southern tier in the Elmira Corning area. She found 12 chestnut-sided warblers in the Keogh Nature Preserve. And I heard about breeding mourning warblers and a red-tailed hawk nest over in the Lindsay Parsons Biodiversity Preserve from Joe Kloppel. And Donna Scott mentioned to me about her couple of visits to Salmon Creek and also to the Roy H. Park Preserve. Many of you, I'm sure, also made your own visits and found your own highlights and hopefully found your own comfort, solace, meaning, perspective, distractions. And so that's a purpose of the Spring Bird Quest. Birds make us happy. They bring us together even when we can't be together. And so that is something that we try to celebrate. And then moving along this left edge of the triangle, we have birds and land. Another purpose of the Spring Bird Quest is to remind us that birds and land are inextricably linked. The warblers that we saw on the sunny edge and the thrashers in the open scrub at Lindsay Parsons and the ravens on the lip of that wild, wild gorge, and even honorary American dippers in our waterways. Diverse, thriving birds need diverse, thriving habitats. And so you remember that blue-winged warbler and that palm warbler saying, here I am, I'm a blue-winged warbler. Here I am, I'm a palm warbler. Well, for birds, when they say, here I am, where is here? Here is the habitat. And without here, there is no here I am. There is no I am. Sorry to go all Jean-Paul Sartre on you. I am here, therefore I am. Je suis ici, donc je suis. But it's true. And finally, the bottom edge of the triangle, the connection between land and people, that is probably the most complex link because we people need land. We use it. We sometimes exploit it. We sometimes ruin it. But we also hold the key to its preservation. And this, of course, is where the Finger Lakes Land Trust comes in. This is where the fundraising comes in. They do all of the hard work of partnerships and acquisitions and stewardship to create trails and access for all of us. Fundraising, outreach, all leading to the preservation of these lands for the birds and for us, birders. And so they've created 35 plus public preserves, 145 plus and counting private easements, including new ones that Andy just announced today, and have conserved forever more than 24,000 acres of land in our Finger Lakes region. So you see how rich our map is with this conserved land, and it's thanks to them. And so making these connections, all these connections, people, birds, land, that's the purpose of the Spring Bird Quest. And so that's my parting message tonight, that birds give us so much to love, but the birds that we love depend on preserved land, and preserved land depends in turn on the land trust. And the land trust in turn depends on the support of people like you and me. So with that, I will close my remarks. I'll welcome questions. And again, I thank you so much for your attention, for your tuning in, for your sitting in front of your screens, especially those of you who've been watching your screens all day and Zooming with people, or those of you who are trying Zoom maybe even for the first time. Thank you very much. I'll stop my screen share for now. We can go back to that slide if you like. And thank you for the virtual applause.
Mark, thanks so much. You've made such a difference over the past 15 years. And I just want to look to Kelly now. So people should ask questions by chat. Am I right?
I think so. Or maybe they could say they have a question that I can unmute. I don't know how to do it in an organized way.
So
Mark, you had one special.
yeah, is Swan Yong here?
He is, and I can unmute him if he's. Are you ready?
Yeah. So Swan had. One thing that I'd like to invite people, not only your questions, but also your own experiences that you'd like to elaborate on this month. Actually, there's this bonus thing that I'd like to share. Sorry to sort of. Here we have a bonus. So I wanted to make sure Swan got to this. Swan shared this with me just a couple days ago. Swan, would you like to go ahead and talk through this?
I unmuted you.
Yep. So yeah, I was just going. I hadn't actually walked that trail down in the lower Getches before. So went to the cemetery, found the trail. It was a pleasant morning, but nothing too special singing. And then out in front, suddenly this thing looked down at me. And this was so close, it was basically basically touching distance. If I wanted to, I could almost reach up and touch it. So this is a red morph eastern screech owl. So for those of you who are not familiar, the screech owl has two morphs. The most common ones are gray, but you get the red morph also. And the other notable thing about this fellow is often you see them looking kind of round and plump. But this one was in the skinny pose. They can kind of do that, just suck their feathers in. I guess it looks thin. And I'm guessing it's because it being standing next to a tree, the skinny pose would be its way to camouflage against the tree trunk, except this tree trunk is a beech and smooth and not, doesn't have the markings that would be camouflaged. And it's also not red, so it wasn't really doing a good job of camouflaging itself. But it was a really neat experience.
Swan, thank you so much for that. That's awesome. You're right that I believe that skinny pose is a cryptic posture that owls employ to try to camouflage themselves when they detect someone watching them up close. So we had other people raising their hands. Kelly, can you take charge of calling on people, unmuting them?
Yeah, people can kind of wave their hand around. I'll see if I can. I can't see everybody at once, so it's a little bit of a trick.
Some people actually use the raise hand function in Zoom. I saw Suzanne Giffen raising her hand before.
Or if I can find her on my oh wait, I see her. Suzanne, are you right? Okay, I see you waving. I'm gonna try to unmute you if I can.
Unmute. There we go. Did that work?
Yeah.
Oh, good. I'm so not a techno person. I just wanted to say hi, and I really enjoyed your presentation. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what it means to have an easement. What is the private land easement?
Let's let Andy talk about that one.
Yes, Suzanne, I'm happy to address that. Unlike the most common easements you hear about are a driveway easement, a power line easement, or you usually talk about access, but what we use is what's called a perpetual conservation easement. And this is a legal agreement that's made part of the title of the property and is binding on future owners of the land. And typically it addresses issues like subdivision and development. It typically allows for farming and forestry, but frequently will put some guidelines for that and some limits. And it's a way we can conserve land that then remains in private ownership. We visit typically annually to monitor the agreement. And we have a whole program for ongoing assistance with stewardship. And at the end of the day, we have to be prepared if someone were to violate that agreement and say, I just want to build another house here, to be ready to stand up for the public interest and defend it.
All right, well, thank you.
I think a better way for me to do this is I can offer to unmute anybody, and then if you have something to say, if that makes sense.
Or just unmute everybody and trust us to be quiet.
Well, you can keep yourself muted, but if you have something to say, you know, we would love to hear from you.
I think if we unmute, we might also have trouble with feedback, perhaps. Anyway, I'm also happy to close now. If I realize it's getting late, and as I say, I know that many people have been tied to their screens all day. Many of you have my emails too, so you can send email to the Land Trust, you can send email to me. And again, I so appreciate people's generosity with the fundraising side of things. If you're curious about donating, it's quite simple to find the donate link on the Finger Lakes Land Trust webpage. Just go there, you'll find it. And then if you want to make a donation specifically in association with the Spring Bird Quest, there is a comment field and also an in honor of field. I think you can use either one to specify that a donation is in connection with this. Okay. Kelly, I think maybe we should close down. I'm so grateful to everybody's participation. I don't want to take any more of anybody's time.
Well, thank you again, Mark, so much. I can see from the chat that everybody was just loved your presentation and was super interested. And like Mark said, everybody can feel free to email him or email the Land Trust if you have more questions.
Thank you so much.